Today we're going to do about urban challenges in a developed country. We're going to do about Hong Kong as the country I've chosen. This is for the IGCSE spec 6.2b, where you do need a case study for challenges in a developed country. The areas I'm going to discuss are going to take everything from economics and poverty all the way down to housing, transport, energy, and food and water challenges. So just a bit of context in terms of the size of Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong superimposed onto a map of the wider London area. It's about 70% of the size of London's wider area. It's got a population of 7.5 million. It's a really small but densely populated place. In terms of economy, it's very comparable with other developed countries. So here, Germany and UK, they were very established developed countries. Hong Kong has a GDP that is higher than both of those, very high GDP per capita, so it's a wealthy place. It's about 35,000 per capita, and as we can see from the graph, from the 90s, that has been increasing year on year out. The developed economy that Hong Kong has is largely service-based, so 90% of the people who work in there work in services, which is what we would associate with the post-industrial phase of the Clark-Fisher model. And here's just some examples of the kind of services you might find. It's got a very important stock exchange there, so it's an important financial area in Asia. Any of the financial services, any of the legal services, like lawyers and solicitors associated with that would work in Hong Kong. It's also a very important port, and what it does largely is it re-exports. So products that get sent to it from mainland China then get exported to other parts of the world via the port of Hong Kong, and therefore that is a really important part of its economy. However, it isn't equally distributed, the kind of income. That 35,000 per capita isn't equally distributed. We can see here that there is a large gap between the wealthiest and the poorest. This man on the left is just coming out of a Louis Vuitton, which is a really high-end brand, and this lady is collecting rubbish in the street. It just shows that there is a huge gap. We can see that in the evidence by looking at the Gini coefficient. So that looks at how income is distributed across a population. So the score here is 0.53 for Hong Kong. That puts it in the top 10 most unequal places in the world. Just to give a bit of context, if the score was 0.0, that means that the income in Hong Kong was completely equal, and the UK is 0.35, so it's better than Hong Kong. And places like Denmark and Sweden and lots of Scandinavian countries are even better, they're 0.2. But we can see that 0.5 shows that Hong Kong is economically unequal. The income is held by a few very rich people, and there are lots of people that don't have that kind of £35,000 per capita. Just another graph to show that this has got worse over time. So in the 70s it was 0.4, just above it, and now kind of 2020 it's 0.53. So it's getting worse over time. The wealth gap between the rich and poor is getting worse. This can lead to a process called social polarization. So this means that when the income isn't equal, we often get in a city segregation between different groups. So people will live in different areas of the city perhaps because they can't afford certain areas, and so are forced to live in cheap areas, and the richest can afford the most lucrative places, and so will live in certain areas. So we get this segregation, and this is largely based on the income that people receive and therefore their social economic status. Just the examples of here, we can see on this left graph, this is Hong Kong area, and it shows us that there is varying poverty rates across the whole area. So we might get domestic migrant workers. So these are people that work for the richest people in Hong Kong. They are people that would be cleaners, and they're often people from Philippines and Nepal. They probably earn about a third of that GDP per capita, so about £9,000 a year. And you can see that these people would be concentrated in places like Yuen Long and Kowloon City, where these are places where the poverty rates are much, much higher. However, kind of At the other end of the scale, you would get people we would call expats, wealthy migrants like British, Canadians, Americans, Japanese and Koreans. These would be working in the commercial and financial centres of the city, and therefore they would live in places like central and western. So we get this real divide between rich and the poorest, and where they are actually separated out into different areas of the city. It kind of relates into housing. Housing is really in high demand. It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world, top 5. And because it's the land is under so much demand, it has to be a vertical city. That means that because there's limited space, the land value is so high, it has to grow upwards rather than outwards. And so you get these really tall skyscraper buildings as your typical image of Hong Kong. Most of the people live in flats like this, like high-rise apartment blocks that they rent from the government. And that is largely because the private market is so expensive. So we can see from this graph that it's one of the least affordable housing markets in the world. That is when you're renting or buying private property. It's 20 times more what the average household will be able to earn to buy a property. So imagine if you earned a wage of £60,000 a year. To own a property, it would be 20 times more than that 60,000 to be able to try and buy a property, which is worse than in pretty much any other city in the world. Because the rents are so high and there's only a limited amount of housing that can be rented from the government, sometimes the poorest people have to live in what we call cage homes. So these are the real poorest, and sometimes these will be domestic workers. They have to rent a cage space in a room, where sometimes you can get 10 people living in a room at a time. So this is the real extremes of poverty in Hong Kong. Here's a whole family. This is 4 people living in a room that is very, very, very small. It shows you the extremes of what the conditions for certain people living in Hong Kong. Alongside that, we talk a lot about developing in emerging countries where slums are on the edge of the cities, kind of land that is kind of unwanted. Here, there isn't enough room for slums, and so the slums have to go on top of some buildings. So we get rooftop slums or penthouse slums occurring in places because the housing is so expensive that some people are forced to live kind of in those empty spaces on tops of buildings. Transport is generally something in Hong Kong that is pretty good. They have an integrated transport system. That means they have trams and rails and buses that kind of link up together. And one thing that kind of helps link all these areas is the octopus card. It's very similar to the Oyster card in London. You can get onto a tram with your octopus card and then get onto a train and just kind of swiping in between. Because it's so good, the public transport system, 90% of all the journeys taken in Hong Kong are used by public transport. So that's pretty good. However, because, as we've seen, that the incomes are going up in Hong Kong, there is more people buying their own vehicles. And because there's a limited amount of space to be able to build any new roads to accommodate these new amount of cars, we're getting more traffic congestion and more air pollution. So as cars increase and the roads get busier and therefore more traffic and air pollution, despite having a pretty good public transport system. Waste is a really big issue, as we can see from this diagram. 6.4 million tonnes a year is produced by the population living there, and the worst thing is that only 30% of that is actually recycled. So most of the waste actually ends up in landfills. This is a boat that's taking it away to dump it in a landfill site. And even worse than that is the fact is that those landfill sites in Hong Kong are filling up. So they're pretty full by 2020 and there's very little options. So sometimes they're going to have to actually export some of their trash to places like China to deal with it. Very, very little recycling plants on Hong Kong as well, so they can't even manage the amount of waste that they've got, even if they could separate into recycling. They have tried to implement a waste charge. So this is a charge for every litre of trash that you gave, which was about £3 a month to locals, but they actually got rid of that in 2020. So waste is a huge, huge problem in Hong Kong. In terms of energy, we can see from this pie chart, this is where all of the energy sources are in Hong Kong, that 99% of it is produced by fossil fuels. This is a pretty significant problem because very little of that energy is renewable, and therefore this is not sustainable for the long-term future. Also, because it doesn't have many natural coal fields or gas fields, oil, all of that kind of coal will be imported from places like China, so it's reliant on China for that. This, the use of those coal-powered power stations creates something called smog. So this is where kind of natural fog mixes with the pollution that is fired out from the coal, from those power stations. We also talked about those cars on the road, so more cars, more coal being pumped up, and even adding some industrial pollution from just over the road in China. All of that adds up to create these really bad air pollution conditions where visibility can be really low at certain times of the year in Hong Kong. As we said with energy, Hong Kong has to rely on China for most of its water. It's pumped from the Dongyang River in China. This is because there's pretty much no lakes and rivers on Hong Kong. That's the same also for the food. Here's like a map showing the agricultural land, which back in the 40s, there was areas that were available to use for agricultural land. However, by the 2000s and into 2020s, there is very little room for agricultural land. It makes up very little of the GDP, and so most of the food will be imported again from places like China. So we can see that there is a real reliance from Hong Kong on lots of its kind of needs of energy and water and food that has to be imported from China. So there's a really delicate balance to be put between if political problems happen between China and Hong Kong, then it could mean that some of their kind of key resources could be cut off, and it's not really sustainable for the future.